Today, I come to you vulnerable, with no makeup, but something heavy on my heart. Yeah, we gotta talk about it. But first, hi, I'm Adelaide, writer, YouTuber, Twitch streamer, and hopefully one day author. I have a bachelor's in creative writing. I love to talk about stories, and I read this book a while ago and have had thoughts about it ever since. So this video has been a long time coming. I read this book series a few years ago. It's hard to remember when because I'm really bad with time. And not to use an outdated term, but it did quickly become my Roman Empire. This series specifically is both really good at certain things and really bad at others. I think this video is going to take me a really long time to make. I'm gonna need to talk about the other books. I'm going to need to reread more. But today specifically, I just want to talk about this book. I'm going to do this string of consciousness, and I hope that this makes sense. I think that ACOTAR is one of those books that people love to lift up as this amazing feat of fantasy, right? And then they love to put it down and say that it's smut garbage. And the truth is somewhere in the middle. There's not really anything spicy in this book, of my memory. I started trying to reread this book, but we'll get to why I haven't finished it yet. But as I'm aware, there's not all that much in this book. As they go on, they get spicier, but guys, come on. This isn't actually that extreme. Game of Thrones is much smuttier than this, you know? Now, I will say the truth is somewhere in between, right? These are not perfect books. They're not the best books I've ever read. I think the main thing that A Court of Thorns and Roses does have going for it is that it was very good at putting all of the most currently popular trends in romantasy into one text. And that is what made it sell so well. That is part of what made it so popular. Before we get to that, though, I think it's important to talk about why this book series meant so much to me when I first read it. Why this is something that has stuck in my brain for so long. A little bit about me. Hi. I have ADHD. I was diagnosed in 3rd grade, and I was also diagnosed with a learning disability at that time, which basically meant that I had extra time on tests. I actually talked a little bit about my journey with reading in general on TikTok, actually. It was one of the first TikToks I posted. I've always had a complicated relationship with reading. Reading was something that always took me a long time, but there were certain things that had always been exceptions to that rule. Certain books I would just sort of devour in one night. Very rarely that would happen. Sometimes fan fictions, I would read really long fan fictions very quickly without really thinking much of it. But I always considered myself to be a slow reader, and I was told by the people around me that that was the case, and I felt that that was the case. I was slower at a lot of things than the people around me. And when I went off to college, I had to read a lot for school, and that was my focus. And then when I got out of college, I realized for the first time that the reason I loved reading when I was younger was escapism. I went to college for creative writing, and I graduated college and I didn't want to read. That's not good. You need to read to write. Reading is intrinsic to writing books. But I wanted to write books and I wasn't really reading. And now that I'd graduated from college, I wasn't reading for escapism, because when I was at home, I didn't want to escape. And when I was at work, I didn't have time to read. I had to work. And so I was in this weird in-between spot where I wasn't really able to read the way I did when I was younger. And it took a while, but I slowly found my love of reading again. I really attribute that to a lot of the webtoons. I started reading webtoons. I started reading comics. I read fan fiction. I kind of read fan fiction that whole time. I always loved fan fiction. We can talk about that at some point. And I really started reading graphic novels. I read graphic novels like Squad and Snapdragon. Oh, there's probably more. I'll put some of them on the screen if I can think of them. But I wasn't really reading novels the way that I used to. I did read a few novels. I read Howl's Moving Castle, but that took me a very long time. It took me a year to finish it. And I just wasn't really reading novels the way that I had when I was younger. I wasn't finishing them or reading them very fast at all. But I was working on a work in progress, which is still unfortunately a work in progress, that has themes. It's a YA project with fae themes. And I was like, I really like to see what is currently going on in literature with whatever it is I'm talking about. So when I started writing my vampire project, I watched a lot of vampire movies and read some vampire books. And now that I was starting this fae project, I was like, why don't I read some of the popular fae books? I know that I've been seeing people talking about fae books. I'll just read them now. And I had heard of A Cruel Prince and A Court of Thorns and Roses. Now, in retrospect, what I really probably should have read was Cruel Prince. It is a lot more in line with the kind of stuff that I was actually going to be writing, but this was the book that I got a hold of first. And so I read this book, and I read this book in 3 days. Now, sit with me on that, because this book is in fact about 419 pages. That's a lot. And for someone who is like always like, I'm too slow, I can't read, I'm not good at reading. It says otherwise. You finished this whole book. That's a big deal. And it was a big deal for me. And it was really the start of me reading again in my adulthood. And I think that's the case for a lot of people. A lot of people started reading again because of this book series. And I think that is a net good. That's a net positive. I didn't know if I wanted to make this video because I know that there is a lot of like controversy surrounding Sarah J. Maas. There are allegations of her copying people when it comes, that there's been some copying allegations with this book. I think from what I understand that those are not true. And then there's also the whole thing with her post about Breonna Taylor, which was very distasteful. And she has yet to apologize for, which I think is the bigger thing here. And I didn't know about any of that when I picked up this book for the first time. And when I went to the internet thinking, I need to talk about this with someone, and I started to see all this controversy, I was like, oh no. I was like, I don't want to platform her on my channel or talk about her book series if she's like super problematic, I don't want to convince people to read this book or talk about this book in any positive way if the author is like problematic and stuff. But I feel like at this point, she is so popular that this video on my channel with less than 100 followers, and I will admit, I'm very thankful that all of you are here. That is not a detriment. There are a lot of us here. If we were all standing in a room together, I would be very socially anxious. So thank you for all being here. But I feel like I'm not going to make that much of a difference in making this video. And I feel as though I must get this off my chest so I can stop feeling these feelings. I need to make it a video, alchemize it, and let it go. So with that in mind, I'm just gonna say, if you watch this video and you feel inspired, please go to your local library. Libby is great if you want to do the audiobook. Check out your local library. With that being said, I want to talk about this book. Now, there was a thing about this book specifically that I always found to be very interesting, but I felt like every time I tried to explain this to someone, they would assume it was an insult, but it's not. It's actually an asset. When you first open this book, it takes about it takes to about here before they mention anything magical. And it's a location, it's a group of people, and it's a location. And before all of that, this could have been in any book. In fact, I think that our opening scene of A Court in Thorns and Roses has a striking resemblance to some of the early stuff that happens in the Hunger Games. This book starts with Feyre, and she is hunting for food for survival. But picture with me for a moment that this is Katniss. The forest had become a labyrinth of snow and ice. I've been monitoring the parameters of the thicket for an hour, and my vantage point in the crook of a tree branch had turned useless. The gusting wind blew thick flurries to sweep away my tracks, that buried along with them any signs of potential quarry. Hunger had brought me farther from home than I usually risked, but winter was a hard time, Animals had pulled in, going deeper into the woods than I could follow, leaving me to pick off the stragglers one by one, praying they'd last until spring. They hadn't. I wiped my fingers over my eyes, brushing away the flakes clinging to my lashes. Here, there was no telltale trees stripped of bark marking the deer's passing. They had yet to move on. They would remain until the bark ran out, and then trees north past the wolves' territory, perhaps, into the fey lands of Prinith. So there you go. That is the point. That we realize, oh shit, this is about fairies. Takes a second, right? Hunger Games opens up with a dream, with Katniss waking up. But eventually, Katniss has a similar scene. Hunger Games is like literally perfect, and if I think about it too long, I start to feel inferior as a writer. But this book could be confused with being about Katniss, right? At least at the start. This first scene could be in an apocalyptic setting, and until we get the tale of the fairies' lands, we don't really even realize where we are, except you know you're reading a fantasy book. And early on, that is really the case, right? Like, we don't actually get all that much fantasy information. All of the information we get that feels fantasy, we get mentions of the fact that she's scared of these fae. She says anything but fairies. The hunters had beseeched our long-forgotten gods, and I had secretly prayed alongside them. In 8 years, we'd been living in our village, 2 days' journey from the immortal border of Prythian. We had been spared an attack, though traveling peddlers sometimes brought stories of distant border towns left splintered in bones and ash. These accounts only rare enough to be dismissed by the village elders as hearsay, in recent months become commonplace, whispering on every market day. We get early on this idea that she is scared of the fae, and then it is only reinforced by this statement here. And this is all in the first chapter, right? But as far as information goes on the fae themselves, we don't get all that much. We don't really know anything because Feyre doesn't know anything. And that is the important thing about A Court on Thorns and Roses. All of the information we get in these earlier chapters is bare bones fantasy knowledge that we have to know. And everything else could be a story that takes place in our worlds or a different setting. It could be any setting. And a lot of people think that's bad because this is fantasy. And the thing with fantasy that a lot of people love about this genre is its world building. And fantasy is known for having these very complicated worlds with all of these new words and terms and magic systems. And that is something that is really good about fantasy. That is a great thing about this genre. However, if you want to know why A Court of Thorns and Roses is popular, it's because it is easily accessible by people who love fantasy and those who don't. There are many people who read A Court of Thorns and Roses, and that got them back into reading, but they didn't necessarily keep reading fantasy books, right? They started reading all sorts of other stuff. A Court of Thorns and Roses is a little generic in that way. One of the things about this book that I think is kind of interesting is that when it comes to... Actually, okay, I'm gonna check my notes here, because I think old me said some interesting things, okay? So I said, fantasy is a notoriously difficult genre to get into. It's hard to write, and it's especially hard to read. This is because of world building. When a setting doesn't exist in our world, the reader starts the story with no context or understanding of how anything works. So the author of the fantasy novel often has to drop a giant mountain of exposition on the reader in the first few chapters. This massive amount of information is usually a turnoff for non-fantasy readers. Fantasy readers are accustomed to this. They expect it and have the context that they'll enjoy a fun fantasy story if they just do their homework. Fantasy novels put a lot of exposition up at the front end of the book. And oftentimes they will even try to entrench you into this setting by using their own made-up words right up front, as well as using situational context to tell you what that thing is. An example being, they might have a different word for wine or their magic powers. And so they might have a sentence like, I used my elitis to open the door with a wave of my hand. And then you better remember what a lightus is, but in the next few chapters, later you'll have two characters sitting together talking about a lightus without context, and you will be completely confused if you forgot what a lightus is. But ACOTAR doesn't do that. Instead, it takes a very bare bones approach, which is what I showed you earlier, right? So this is the thing that I learned from A Court of Thorns and Roses. I think oftentimes as writers of fantasy, we think that in order to make a world rich and often interesting, we must add a gazillion never before seen details. And I think those details are important. But I think what is equally important is balance. The minimalism of world building in the first book works to the story's advantage. It's why it's so accessible for a high fantasy series and a solid reminder to authors and writers alike that we oftentimes needlessly complicate our writing. However, I will say that this minimalistic style does not hold up in future books as well as it does in the first one, at least from my perspective. And weirdly, this thing that I like about this first book becomes my qualm with the rest of the series. So let's ask this question, right? Does A Court of Thorns and Roses have bad world building? The short answer is yes and no, but the longer answer is complicated, and ultimately there are many positive and negative things about this book specifically. So let's get into it. There's a reason that books in a series are often so front heavy with information and history. You do your homework right away, and then you get to go play outside later, right? That is the setup. You do your homework, and then you get to go play outside. And then after that, any new information found in the story is often also new to the main character as it is to the reader, right? Which helps increase the level of excitement and connection to said character. The way A Court of Thorns and Roses introduces the lore of the world is in a way that I've never personally seen before, because you get more world building in the back half than the front of the series. And in the book, you get more world building in the back half of the book than the front. And for this book specifically, I think it works really well and is why it's so popular. Because people who don't read fantasy don't want to do their homework first. They don't care. But if you let them go play outside first and then make them care about the homework before they've even seen it, then when it shows up, they actually care. Does that make sense? That's what this book series does. It plops you in the story. It doesn't tell you all that much, and it just tries to reel you in with its characters alone. But then as the story goes on, the mystery of what the hell is going on becomes so compelling that you keep reading until ultimately you get a shit ton of exposition near the back half. But I do think that this book struggles in other places, right? For example, if we were to actually compare it properly to a book like The Hunger Games, we will find that the devil's in the details and that there isn't a lot of details in A Court of Thorns and Roses. The Hunger Games puts a bigger emphasis on things like hygiene and the food of the capital. And it does so, it puts more emphasis on these things because it's a part of its thesis statement as a book. The class divide that the people in the districts are suffering versus the people in the capital that were rewarded for just being born in a particular place. It's like Susan Collins is saying to the readers, look how much these people have and how little Katniss has, and then watch what they force her to do. Whereas A Court of Thorns and Roses uses how little Feyre has as a way to show why her animosity runs deep, which of course can be achieved in many ways, not just world building. Do not drink every single time I say world building. You will die. However, seeing as this is the first book in the series, spoilers, that builds up to a continental-wide war, this context is crucial, imperative in fact. This is to show the show and show don't tell. Because if we can see how vastly different the quality of life is in the Spring Court versus the human realm, even when the Spring Court is being held hostage, then we can understand how small and how little the humans have in ways of protecting themselves. Ultimately, this first book, I think the reason that it was so popular was because it doesn't make you do your homework. And it doesn't make you think very deeply, but it makes you want to think deeply. It gives you a situation and it's sexy and it's cool and you're like, what's gonna happen? But it doesn't tell you what's going on. And that's why you want to know what's going on. The other big thing with A Court of Thorns and Roses that I think is very important, that I'm almost getting to but not quite saying in this video, is that Feyre's journey of not knowing what's going on and the lack of information is very smartly integrated into the story itself. They're intentionally withholding a lot of information about the Fey world and what is currently going on in it from Feyre, and that parallels the reader's journey of not knowing what the hell is going on either. And so the same way that the reader doesn't know anything and really, because of that lack of information, wants more and is like craving more information, Feyre is in a similar place of not having any information and wanting and craving more. And so as the wool is pulled off of Feyre's eyes, the wool is also pulled off of the reader's eyes. And one of the elements to this, and this is a bit of a spoiler, is that they have actually hidden what things look like from Feyre. So one of the people in the story, the maid that is like in charge of her, is actually like a tree person, but Feyre sees her as like a little old lady because they've hidden this Fey nature from her. And there's all of these like little pixies floating around that Feyre can't see. And it's not until they kind of take this veil away from her, this magical veil that was protecting her from witnessing all this stuff, that she sees how magical and mystical everything around her is. And similarly, it kind of feels like wading into a pool. Like the way that A Court of Thorns and Roses is written is that it's taking someone who's not experienced with the fantasy genre and taking their hand and slowly pulling them into this world and setting versus what you normally get with fantasy, which is kind of throwing you into the deep end and being like, hey, I'm going to teach you how to swim, and then teaching you the ropes as they're throwing all this terminology at you. Whereas The Court of Thorns and Roses is Sarah J. Maas taking you by the hands and slowly walking you from like this much water to like being up to your neck and by like the war book. I forget what it's called. It's the war book in my head. The one where they're at war? Yeah, that one. Anyways. And so she takes it very, very slowly. And by the time you get there, you understand everything. You know what's going on, yada, yada, yada. But she does take you so slowly that a lot of people are like, this isn't high fantasy, blah, 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 this isn't, blah, 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 there's no world building, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no, there is. She just takes her sweet time getting there. And if the new books that are coming out in the fall are anything to show for it, she literally said that 2 of them are basically the same book, but they weren't allowed to be published that way because you can't glue that big of a book together. She loves a lot of words and to take her time on the page telling you all this information. She loves to spread this stuff out. So you have to be willing to go with her for a while. And not everyone is. Back to past me, I guess. Here's my weird thing. I had very low expectations for A Court of Thorns and Roses because it was so popular. And popular things are often either amazing or kind of bad, Like, Twilight's not my personal favorite. Big respect to Stephenie Meyer, but it's not my personal favorite. And I was thinking maybe we were going that way. And this was better than I thought it was going to be. However, here's what I will say. For me, this is not a book that holds up to a reread. That is a big thing. It does not hold up to a reread for me. And I have a lot of books that I really love that do hold up to rereads. This is not one of them. I can revisit sections of it fine, and the ending is more interesting to me than anything else. But now that I know what's going on, I am not as interested in the mystique of most of this book. Now, does that make it bad? No. It does further my complicated relationship with it, though. Her relationship with her family and her sisters specifically, is very well written. I will say that. Feyre as a character in this book, at least to me, is incredibly well written. She is very frustrating, but that all good protagonists should be because it gives her room to grow. All of her siblings feel like real people. And Lucien, if I'm saying that right. I'm, by the way, so bad at pronouncing fantasy names. I'm gonna piss you off. In Lucien, all of these characters, fantastic. I love them very much. No notes. No, there's some notes. We'll talk about it. I hope any of this video made sense. I'm going to make another video about the second book. And then I think I'm gonna combine the next 3 books into one video because I have a lot of feelings. I have like minimal feelings on all 3, but they're a little bit more edgy. So I'll just combine them because, you know, the vibes. And then I'll talk about the last book in its own video. And then maybe by then the new ones will come out. I don't know. We'll talk about them as they come out, I guess. But yeah, so I just wanted to just put that out there. So anyway, thank you so much for watching my video. I hope you have a good day. I hope you're doing well. This is, I guess, a no makeup video since I'm not wearing makeup now either. I am Adelaide Ordell everywhere. Instagram, TikTok, Twitch, and I usually stream about 3 times a week, depending. I'm still trying to figure out how to upload on YouTube weekly and also stream 3 times a week. It's been a little tricky, but we're figuring it out. But yeah, you can find me everywhere. I've been uploading videos. I am still working on that Zombies 2 video. I promise. Don't worry. It's coming out at some point. And yeah, bye-bye.